Kia ora koutou katoa. Ko Dr. Alastair Clement. Good afternoon, everyone. I've been asked to talk about flood resilience, and I think that it's quite fitting that within this context of understanding our catchment better, we're going to talk quite a lot about understanding in this talk. Just in terms of the flow of the talk, I'm going to talk really briefly about what the natural hazards team at the council does, because that kind of informs the perspective that I'm bringing to flood resilience. I'm going to talk really briefly about what flood resilience is. Going to start by talking about smaller floods and the potential for nature-based solutions to provide some preparation to protect us from these smaller floods. Provide some high-level results from some feasibility modelling that we've done recently. Then I'm going to shift focus to talk about large floods, and I'm going to suggest to you that the key for resilience for large floods is understanding them and avoiding them. We'll talk a little bit about future planning as well. So in the natural hazards and geomorphology team, we focus on understanding natural hazards across the district. Earlier, Mike suggested that these events are happening really frequently, and also that the time frame between the events can be quite short. In the natural hazards team, we tend to think that the living memory for remembering the impact of an event can be as short as about 4 to 7 years. So it's as little as 4 to 7 years after an event before we get people making inquiries of us and going, no, my property's never been affected. And we go, but what about? So in terms of understanding natural hazards across the district and our learning in terms of resilience, we try to be the district's memory. We do that through studying historic flood maps. We produce flood modelling. Mike talked a little bit about that. We also go out there during events and we take photos. We took over 5,000 photos during the June and July flood events so that we could record the impacts across the district and we could learn from those impacts. The key thing that we do with all of that understanding, it wouldn't be any good if we just stored it away and didn't tell anybody about it. The key thing that we do is we provide advice to a wide range of stakeholders internally at the council and across the district. Our focus, though, is typically on avoiding the impacts of natural hazards. And that's because a lot of the work that we do is in the context of if you want to build a new building, if you're getting a resource consent, and there's some constraints there that we have to work to. Climate change is also baked into everything that we do. Mike talked a bit about climate change. I'm going to talk a bit about climate change as well. We're also thinking longer term into the future, and that's what we need to think about. We're thinking about resilience. So what is flood resilience anyway? I've taken this definition here from the Scottish Environment Agency, but there are loads and loads of definitions of flood resilience out there. This definition I quite like because it links in quite nicely, I think, with the work that we do in the natural hazards team. So here I'm suggesting that flood resilience is our ability to avoid the effects of flooding, and where we can't avoid the effects of flooding, that we are being well prepared, that we respond well to the effects of flooding, that we recover quickly from damaging flood events. So there's some key components there then. There's understanding. We need to understand about flooding, and also things like erosion that accompany flooding. We need to avoid the effects of flooding. We need to prepare for flooding when it's going to occur, because we can't always avoid flooding, so we're going to need to prepare for it, where we might have properties or land uses that are exposed to flooding. We need to make sure that we can respond effectively to flooding when it occurs. And finally, there's that recovery phase that we find ourselves in at the moment. In the first part of the talk, I'm going to focus on preparing. There we are. I'm going to look at some nature-based solutions that could enable us to prepare for smaller floods. And then later on, I'm going to talk about understanding big floods and make the case for why we should avoid them. So, nature-based solutions, it's all about slowing the flow. Slowing the flow of water through the catchment, making sure that it's spread out and distributed through time and space. The diagram I've got on the upper right of the slide here is a whole bunch of different conceptual nature-based solutions for different parts of the catchment. We've got the upland part of the catchment, the middle reaches of the catchment, and the coastal part of the catchment. So nature-based solutions, it's all about storing that water in the catchment and slowly releasing it. But I'm not going to try and oversell it. Like nature-based solutions, it allows us to prepare for smaller floods. Nature-based solutions are not a panacea for these big floods. So we might be able to slow the flow, reduce the damage for something like a 20-year flood event. The thing I like about nature-based solutions as an idea is that they align with a lot of other catchment values. So things like ecosystem services, ecological outcomes, things like that. So for our nature-based solutions, we undertook a feasibility study because there's no point coming and talking to you about nature-based solutions if it's not even feasible to actually implement them. And for our study, we focused actually on the middle and the upper reaches of the Motueka catchment. The first broad category of nature-based solutions that we focused on was revegetation of the upper catchment and parts of the floodplain. So looking at things like catchment woodlands, sorry I got this figure from the northern hemisphere so they're called woodlands, catchment and riparian vegetation essentially. And if we are enhancing vegetation, then we're also going to see some nice outcomes then in terms of soil and land management as well. The second broad category of nature-based solutions that we looked at to see whether or not it was feasible in the mock catchment was leaky barriers or dams. And we don't have a lot of experience with doing leaky barriers or dams in New Zealand. This photo here is actually, it's from the UK. But the idea with a leaky barrier or a dam is that we might put some wood in a stream in a really controlled way. We're not just going out there and chucking wood everywhere, by the way. And that water can essentially pile up behind that wood when there's a flood and then get slowly released and leak through it. It's also a really great habitat there, by the way. The final thing that we looked at in our study was floodplain reconnection and storage. So when we have a flood, as Mike talked about this morning, the water comes out of the channel and it floods across the floodplain. And so we can store that water temporarily on the floodplain during these flood events and then allow it to drain back into the river channel. So how do we go about assessing the feasibility of these nature-based solutions to slow the flow in the Motueka catchment? We built a computer model that represents the hydrology of the Motueka catchment. And we fed into it the topography, the hydrology and the land cover of the mock catchment. Then we calibrated that model to historic flood events to make sure that the model was representative of reality. We ran some scenarios for future climate change as well. And then we looked at the feasibility of these different nature-based solutions at different points through the catchment. And the way that we evaluated them was by comparing flood hydrographs. A flood hydrograph is just the flow of water past a point over time. And if we can slow the flow, then what that means is that we can make the flood hydrograph, the peak of that curve, not be so peaky. Now the report on this is like 70 pages long and it's got 1,000 graphs in it, and I'm not going to blast you with graphs, but I just wanted to talk about some high level results because this was a feasibility study. In the upper right of the slide here, got one of these comparison hydrographs. We've got the dashed line there, those are the baseline runs. So those are the runs of the model without the nature-based solutions. And the solid lines there is when we ran the model with the nature-based solutions in there. And the key thing about all of those runs that we've represented there for Woodstock, Wangapeka and Tapawera is that the nature-based solutions curve is lower than the baseline curve. So that means all of that water that's moving through the catchment is being spread further out in time through those nature-based solutions because they've slowed the flow. The peak, it's not as peaky which means that there's not as much water, as much energy, it's not as damaging. When we did some model runs there that we looked at increased vegetation, we increased vegetation in the upper part of the catchment. It's kind of unsurprising, but it decreased flows between 5 and 27%. We increase the connection between the river and the floodplain. That does have impacts, but those impacts, in the model at least, were quite localised within the subcatchments, and they didn't flow through into the main river. Similarly, leaky barriers, both on the channel and across the floodplain, they also had localised impacts within the subcatchments within which we modelled them. But what was really effective was when we employed a combination of approaches. So when we did vegetation increases in conjunction with increasing the connection between the river and the floodplain, in conjunction with leaky barriers, that was when we really started to see results. A 9% decrease in flood flows at Woodstock, up to a 36% decrease in flood flows in some of these subcatchments. Off the top of my head, that's the Stanley Brook. So nature-based solutions then, there's an opportunity here that we could leverage for future resilience from these smaller floods. So we could take the results from this study, we could use local knowledge. We've got people in the room like Seb Dondonka, who I think has used nature-based solutions quite widely overseas. We could integrate the findings from this into the work through organisations like the Motueka Catchment Collective and the work that TDC is doing. These nature-based solutions, again, as I've already mentioned, I really like them as well because they link in with a whole load of other things that we really value about the catchment, including the living rivers paradigm. And when this sort of session was originally conceived, living rivers was something that was talked about, and nature-based solutions really link in with that. So, through the first part of the talk then, I've talked about preparing for smaller floods through nature-based solutions. Now I'm going to talk about understanding big floods and avoiding them. And some of my talk here is going to overlap a little bit with Mike's talk, but I think that that's okay because it's just nice to reinforce some of these ideas. So making the bridge between nature-based solutions for small floods and big floods, we've got the floodplain. The floodplain is nature's solution for big floods. Here I'm talking about a 1 in 50 year, a 1 in 100 year, or bigger floods. So the sorts of floods that we saw in June and July. Floodplains accommodate floodwaters during these big events. They're like the lungs of the river. They allow the river to breathe. Functioning floodplains, they provide really valuable services. And we can also put ourselves between a rock and a hard place if we disconnect the river from the floodplain. For example, we could put some stop banks along there. And then there would be some detrimental effects that we would have to manage forever, as long as we had those stop banks there. So I'd suggest that resilience for bigger floods relies on understanding the role of the floodplain. So the point that I made on the previous slide is that disconnecting the river from the floodplain increases pressure on infrastructure like stop banks. And Mike made that point, I think, this morning as well. Mike also made the point that infrastructure capacity is further reduced due to climate change. The graph that I've got on the lower right of the slide there, that's very similar to a graph that Mike showed this morning. Mine's not on a log scale, Mike's was on a log scale, so Mike had a straight line where I've got a curvy line, but they're the same graph. And the point here that Mike made this morning as well, I'm going to reiterate it because it's a really important point. Climate change is putting more water into the atmosphere, creating more rain. And what that can do to our flood frequency curves is that it pushes them upwards. And what that means is that for a flood of a given size, for a flood of a given recurrence interval, like a 1 in 50 year flood, in the future, it's going to be bigger. There's going to be more water. And also, the flood, that amount of water that we get for today's 1 in 50 year flood, that's going to happen more frequently into the future. You joke. One more minute. Okay, I apologise. I used to be a university lecturer and I'm used to talking at people for an hour. I apologise. Big floods, they're going to get bigger. Today's big flood is going to occur more frequently. The key thing that we focus on in the natural hazards team is making sure that dwellings are a safe place of refuge for people. So if we want you to be out of the floodplain, we want you to be like the red house on the margin of the floodplain. If you have to be in the floodplain, we want you raised up above that water. For dwellings also, we need to look out into the future because we need to consider the full life of a dwelling. And Mike made the point this morning with the stats. It's the same point that I'm making here. It's more likely than not that over the life of a dwelling, if you built that dwelling on the floodplain that's, say, going to be flooded by a 100-year flood, that dwelling will be impacted. It is more likely than not. Really, really quickly, development on floodplains, it's a national issue. It's not restricted to, say, the Motueka by any means. Auckland Council's approved 4,000 new homes. There's a new national policy statement for natural hazards that's coming that's going to talk about this sort of stuff as well. And there's new regional plans coming because the RMA is being reformed. So I'm suggesting that in terms of these big floods, what could you do? Understand the role of floodplains. Get involved in the opportunities to shape the plans that talk about how our communities use and engage with floodplains. I will not go through the summing up because I've run out of time. I apologise. Thank you very much. That's okay.
I know time is short, and I apologise for that. We were trying to create a really interesting day, and we didn't have, taking, for people to take so much time out of their day, and we're just grateful that you were able to come for what you could. But all these will be available, this material that has been presented, so don't rest assured we haven't missed out. So we're on to our final presenter. Let me get my Seb. Welcome. Is a wetland river engineer with stream and river consultants. He's an international expert in the aquatic ecosystem management and restoration. He has recently led multiple regional projects to improve wetlands and waterways, integrating flood control and enhancing with biodiversity outcomes for our next generation. And today Seb's going to